As we look at this first chapter in the book of Daniel, in this chapter, there is so much in it that connects with really important things, other things in the Bible, and which gives weight to what it's teaching. Okay, some very, very important things. And we haven't got the time to look at all of those things. In fact, our time has run away already. So we're just going to pick up on a couple of them. We're not going to turn to all the verses. But the first thing, the key thing that just for now I want to draw our attention to, and we'll look at chapter 1 again next week, is the changing of the names of Daniel, Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael. Okay? Their names are changed. Now, if you'll hopefully know that Daniel and his friends, they have been, as we saw earlier, they've been kidnapped. You can imagine the scene, Daniel in his home with his family, and suddenly the door's broken down, soldiers storm into the place, and his parents must have been, and the rest of the family, must have been absolutely confused and shocked and horrified to see men invading their home. Can you imagine that? How terrifying it must be. And they ignore everyone in the house, but they see Daniel and they make a beeline for their son. And this is a brother of others. They grab him. Now, if you're a parent, you would have fought, wouldn't you? You would fight for your son as he's being dragged out. But they were powerless against these soldiers, trained, armed soldiers. And all they could do was watch helplessly as Daniel, they're probably most likely about 15 years old. We'll look at how we know that a bit later, but not today, but in next week. But all they could do is look on helplessly as Daniel is dragged away. And they never, ever see their son or hear from him again. Almost certainly. And Daniel never sees them. I mean, that is a terrible thing. I can't imagine what it was like for Daniel seeing his mother screaming and his father probably laying beaten after trying to rescue him. The last images of his home. And he's taken away. And he finds himself in a strange place. Now, Babylon was one of the most extraordinary places on the face of the planet at the time. I would encourage you, go and Google, okay, when you get home, images, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Okay, you'll see. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, what it was is Nebuchadnezzar's wife, she came from a beautiful place and, where there was beautiful country and everything else, and she wanted a home that reflected something of that. And she had they had an amazing palace built, and built into the palace were gardens at every level, so that it was just it was like a mix between a palace and a beautiful garden. Absolutely stunning. No expenses spared. Okay, and the architecture of Babylon was phenomenal. Okay, again, we don't have the time to look at, we're going to look at some of this stuff in the Bible studies, but it was absolutely phenomenal. As Daniel was in the back of a cart being taken to wherever he was going to go, he must have looked around. He's never seen anything like this place before, this amazing city. And they must have been pretty worried. Daniel and his friends, not only have they gone through the trauma of being separated, not just from their family, but everything they've ever known. They wouldn't have ever sort of travelled outside of Judah, where they came from. They came from the city Jerusalem in Judah. Probably would never have travelled outside of that. And so this is that days later, 700 miles later, something like that, they find themselves in this place, or 1,000 miles actually. They find themselves in this place. Now, they must have been wondering as they were going, where they were being taken and what was going to happen. They must have been wondering, why have they taken us? Why me? because it was a very few people that were taken. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they laid siege on Jerusalem, on Judea and Jerusalem 3 times. The first time they took a very small number of people. Daniel was among them. It says there that the handsome, the fit, the strong, the most clever and intelligent. They wanted the creme de la creme. That's what they were going for. But they must have been wondering, why have they taken us, young men? There was 3 sieges that Babylon laid. The first was to take these young people. The second, they took a whole load of other people. And the third, they took everyone else, apart from people with no skills, no education, people that they didn't see were going to be of any use to them. They left them. So they left people in Israel. And those people remained in Israel. And the place just fell to rack and ruin. The haunt of jackals, the Bible describes it as. So they must have been wondering, what's going to happen? Daniel must have been very worried, and his friends worried. They must have been praying because they had a strong faith. That's the one thing they had. But it turns out they didn't need to worry, because what they find is they get to this place, they're cleaned up, and they are given the opportunity to go to the number 1 university in the whole world at the time. That's basically what it was. They get the opportunity to go to the most prestigious, best place where you can go and learn in the world, and they are guaranteed that at the end of their training, they are going to be on big money. They are going to be serving in the higher courts of the king. This was, for the average person here, this was a dream come true. It was everything you could have hoped for if you're a bit of a materialist. Power, prestige, money, everything. They were going to get it all, serving the king of the most powerful empire in the world. They didn't need to worry. It tells us that the king had assigned to these people that they should eat the food and drink the wine from the king's table. The best of the best. That's what they were getting. The best of the best. And so they must have been like, they could have been like this. This isn't so bad. This isn't so bad. After 3 years, they'll have got used to they've left their family. They've been really well treated. They'll have got used to it, living pretty much like kings with huge opportunities ahead of them. Well, one of the things that happens is their names are changed. And now, here's the thing that I want us to learn from this, that I believe that is taught to us throughout Scripture, and that we're going to see it in a moment, but how the meaning of words and names gets changed, and how that is a strategy of the evil one, primarily to undermine God's people and who they are in Christ or in God. Okay? So you might think, I know that sounds a bit weird, okay? But let me put it to you in another way. Sometimes we find it hard to be ourselves, don't we? So in one situation, some people are one sort of person in one situation, and then in another situation they're another sort of person, and they change. And maybe that's you. Maybe with certain people you lose confidence, and with other people you're a lot more confident. Okay? Now, why is that? Well, what I want to say is this. It's because we forget, we don't know, we're not clear on who we are in God. That's why we change. When we know who we are, we remain the same, okay? We're in different situations, but it's this, we don't suddenly start acting different or being different or suddenly lose our confidence or whatever. So I want us to have a look at how this works. And we're not going to look at all the verses. I'm just going to refer to them. And it begins right the way back in the Garden of Eden. So when God created man, in fact, even before the Garden of Eden, when God created man, it says this, God said. Do you see that? God spoke. In fact, all of creation came about by God's word, yeah? We know that. God said, let there be light. God speaks and it is, right? Whatever God says is, it is. Simple as that. God says, let there be light, there is light. Let there be, he spoke the sun, the moon, the stars, and all of those things into being. And then he creates man. And how? He begins by these words, let us make man in our own image. God speaks. See the power of speech. And speech is a gift that God has given to us, language. No other animal or creature that we know of uses language like us apart from the angels. Okay, they're the only other creatures that have the power of speech like us. It's the most powerful thing. And God, he creates man in his own image. Now, if you was to look in your NIV and you turn to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, you'll see those words. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created male and female. He created them. But you won't read that, actually. What you'll read is God created mankind. Or sometimes you'll read God created humans. It doesn't say man. In other words, the translators, it's not that they've come up with a better translation. They've interpreted what God has said. Because if you could read, let me put it like this, right? This is what it actually says. God said, let us create Adam, that's the Hebrew word, in our image. Okay, that's the word, Adam. And then it says, so God created Adam in his own image. Male and female, he created them. Okay? So, male and female, the word that God gave for all men and women is Adam. The word Adam means man. It's not a generic term, it's a masculine term. And then he calls the first man he creates, he names him Adam. And the woman, in chapter 2, when she's taken out of man and introduced to Adam, Adam says, she is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, she shall be called woman. Okay, the first part of that means out of, second part man, Adam. Do you see? And in other words, she comes from the man, and the man, Adam, he actually names her. He gives her, God calls Adam. Adam names his wife. In fact, he names his wife twice. He calls her woman because she was taken out of man. That's what woman means. And he names her later Eve because she would be the mother of all the living. So Adam names her. And here's the other thing. Adam was created before Eve. And all of this is telling us something. And I want to reduce it down to one word. Firstness. Firstness. When God created mankind, male and female, he created Adam first. Eve he created second. And Eve was taken from Adam as a helper. Now, the thing is, what I'm teaching you, just isn't popular in the world. The idea that God created one before the other, that one is to be a helper for another, that Adam has authority in naming his wife twice, that isn't popular. And so by changing the name man to human, it extinguishes, it eliminates any sense of this firstness that God has placed there right from the beginning. And just in case though, let me just put a little caveat on all that I've just said. If you think, well, it doesn't seem right that a woman should be there as a helper of man, as if she's kind of secondary, an add-on. And it doesn't seem right that Adam should have any authority over the woman. Remember, think firstness. So, who sinned first? The woman, right? And yet, when God calls them to account, who does he call to account? Adam, the man. Okay? And Adam is the one who is responsible. So in Romans chapter 5, when Paul talks about sin entering the world, it says through one, what? Man. It's like Eve has been almost excused, it seems. Through one man sin entered the world, and through him death came to all men, because all have sinned. Okay? And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it speaks about head coverings and all sorts of strange things. But it talks about how, it says, because man came first. But then it says, but just as man came first, so man comes out of woman. In other words, there's equality. And, just to add to it all, when Adam says, she shall be called woman, he says before that, behold, she is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. In other words, there's a sameness, an equality. She's the same as me, is what he's saying. She's less, but in terms of equality and value and worth, they're exactly the same. In terms of the way that they relate to God and one another, there's a difference. They have different responsibilities. And the last thing just to say on all of that is the idea of the woman being the helper of man. Do you know who else is called man's helper? God. Okay, so it's not a thing about value and worth and anything like that. God is the helper of his people. So, but the point that I'm making is, when you turn to Genesis and you look in more modern translations, you'll see that. It's called dynamic equivalence. It's when the translators, they try and take the meaning. In other words, they decide what the meaning is, and they go beyond translating to interpreting the scriptures for us. So we need to be wary of that. But so their language has changed, okay? And then here's the other thing. God created Adam and Eve. He created them to work the earth, to fill it. He created Eve as a helper of man to help do that, to multiply, fill the earth, right? They were to rule, it says, over the earth, doesn't it? So God gives them great authority to be like kings ruling over the earth. Every man and woman that descends from them is to be like a ruler on the earth, ruling over everything. But they're to rule under God. And they rejected God, didn't they? It wasn't enough for them to be rulers over the world under him. They wanted to be the top dog without any accountability. And now here's the thing, okay? I've said about how translators, even today, there's this change in the language, the way it's used. And what it does is it just cuts us off from the moorings a little bit from Scripture. So it's easier to drift. And people take these translations, they're not critical about them, they just think, oh, it's the Bible. Now it is, and all the truth is in there, but we just need to be wise, okay? So we hold to what is true. But then when Satan came to tempt Adam and Eve, he did something. He changed what God had said. Do you remember? So again, think about the power of speech. God said, you must not eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, for if you eat of it, the day of it, you will die. Satan says, is it true that God said you mustn't eat? Well, Satan says you mustn't eat from any of the trees in the garden. That's the bit that Satan says. In other words, so he changes it. You see that change of language? Again, the moment they engage with that, they've been wrong-footed, right? The moment they begin to engage. What Eve does is she sort of corrects him, but then she changes it, as Jess just pointed out. She said, no. But let me ask you a question, right? When Satan said to her, is it true that God said you must not eat from any of the trees in the garden or you will die? What should Eve have said? Someone tell me. What would a right response have been? It's not true. Satan, you're a liar. That is not what God said. Now, here's what I would say. See, Michael, you've been wrong-footed. And so have you, Mary. Here's what Eve should have said. She should have first looked to her husband, who was standing there passively. You should be doing something about this. That's what she should have done. And Adam should have said, you are a liar. And you're trying to get to us through my wife. And he should have protected her. That's what he should have done. Adam should have stepped up at that point. But they both allowed themselves to be wrong-footed by the whole thing. Do you see? It wasn't Eve that should have been even engaging. Adam should have stepped in and called him out as a liar. Not allowed Eve and then Eve join in the conspiracy of lies. So they change things. And then, a bit after, and then the next thing that happens, as a result of that, here's a word that is very important for Daniel. They are exiled, aren't they, out of the Garden of Eden. And then they come to, the next big event is Genesis chapter 6. the whole world is filled with evil. In other words, God sees there's only one righteous man, Noah and his family. He saves them, and then they multiply. Things go downhill again, don't they? Until what? What's the next big event in the Bible? Very important. Very relevant for what we're thinking about this morning. Just before Abraham, just before, the chapter before, chapter 11, Genesis, Babel. Tower of Babel. Now, when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they were kicked out of the east side, the Bible tells us. And I should have had a map for you. But Babylon is where the Tower of Babel was. And it appears that they've gone east to Babylon. So there they are, and they build this tower. And it tells us in Genesis chapter 11 that they want to make, and this should get alarm bells ringing, because you know what we think about with Daniel. They want to make a name for themselves. What that means is they don't want to be forgotten. They want to be remembered. They want to invent their own identity. We'll decide who we are. We're going to redefine and work out and decide and establish who we are on our own authority and on our own power. And then, in chapter, God messes all that up for them. How does he do it? By confusing their languages. Now here's the thing. They were using the power of speech, God-given gift, in order to defy God. They were going to make a name for themselves. They were going to build a city, a tower that reached to the heavens. They were going to make their own way, establishing themselves. But God destroys all of that. And in Genesis chapter 12, he says to Abraham, leave your father, your mother, your country. Go to the place that I will show you. I will make your name great. God says, I will give you a name. I will give you a new identity. So God gives Adam and Eve an identity. He uses the power of speech to do that, as he does in all things. Adam and Eve, they twist all of that. They ignore what God has said, that they're to rule under him. They want to change all that, be the top ruler and all of that stuff. You can see, can't you, what's happening? And then then they're exiled. And then they go to Babylon, or the descendants end up in Babylon. And we see again, they want to make a name for themselves, a whole new identity. We can work out who we are. But then and God disrupts that and then says to Abraham, I will give you a new name. I will make your name great. And then he leads Abraham to the promised land, Israel. Abraham never settles there. And that's really important as well. It's important because this promised land, but the Bible tells us that God, when Abraham got there, told him to march the length and the breadth of the country. That's what he was to do. And he did that living in tents. That's a strange thing, isn't it? Why do it? Well, because it was his home, but it wasn't his home. He never quite settled. That's another important thing for us. Because later, the Israelites inherited the land after slavery in Egypt and all of that. They settled there. And they forgot that actually this is not their permanent home. And the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham was looking forward to a city from God, a heavenly city. And we read about that in Revelation 21. Abraham knew that this was his home for now, but it was a shadow of what's to come. Anyway, God settles his people ultimately in the promised land. Things go south again. They drift away from God. And they end up being exiled. And here's the thing. They go all the way back to Babylon, where Abraham was taken out of. Now they're back, the whole nation. Isn't that interesting? God called them out, but they've disobeyed. So now they're exiled, gone east again, back to Babylon, where they started. Now what about the names? I don't know, you'll know this, I'm sure you'll know this experience. I've got to find it in my notes now. Oh yeah. I'm sure you'll know this experience, okay, that Daniel and his friends, when they found themselves in this new place, when they were back at home, they had one set of pressures and challenges as believers. But it's different, isn't it, when you're in a new place? If any of you ever find yourself travelling away from your home and you're on your own and there's no one else that knows you around, It's very easy, isn't it? To become, you can think, I can be anyone I like right now. I can do anything I like. No accountability, right? This was the kind of situation that Daniel and his friends were in. They could do anything now. All sorts of temptations. Listen, when you're in those situations, who you are then is really who you really are. It's who you really are. That's what really counts. When you're on your own, when no one else can see you, when you've got freedom to do whatever you please, then what? That is the situation that Daniel and that were in. And, I'm talking here about identity. I began by saying we can be different people sometimes in different situations. And so when we're on our own, and if you're in a hotel somewhere on business or something like that, there's stuff you can watch on the TV that you would never normally watch. We can, get into all sorts of trouble. Why? Because that's who we really are. Well, the attempt in changing Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael's and Azariah's name was an attempt to eliminate and destroy their identity. And that is exactly what we see with Adam and Eve. Their identity as children of God, named, given a purpose and a reason to live, what they're to do, all of that being cast aside for them to just decide what they do, how they're going to do it. And this is what we see with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The name Daniel, this was a name that would have been given to him by his parents, probably prayerfully. And it means, God is my judge. Reminder to Daniel that when he's on his own, Daniel, when you're on your own, your name, his name was a constant reminder, God is my judge. That's good. It's good to remember that when we're on our own. God sees. He's my judge. And his name was changed. It's like, forget that. You can imagine when they first met, sorry, we're going over a bit, but when the Babylonians first met Daniel, they say, what's your, that's a strange name. What does that mean? Oh, it means God is my judge. They'd have been like, what kind of a God is that? Who likes a God that judges? God is my judge. His name is changed to Belteshazzar. And this is what it means. May Bel protect his life. Bel was the name of a foreign god. In other words, they were saying, look, you don't need to worry about the judge. You've got Bel who will now protect you. You can do anything you like. You're safe from this other god. Hananiah, his name ends in AH, which is short for the name of God, Yah. Hananiah. And what it means is this: God shows grace. And his name is changed to Shadrach, the command of Aku. That's what it means, who's the moon god. In other words, God shows grace, which works well with the whole thing of God being Daniel's judge, but he's a gracious God. No. You do as God says. Forget grace now. God commands. And then Mishael, that means who is like God. In other words, it speaks of the uniqueness, total uniqueness of God. His name is changed to Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. In other words, who's like the moon god. Do you see? Changing their name, changing their identity. Azariah means Yahweh or God helps. And his name is changed to Abednego, which means the servant of Nabu. If you watch the Mighty Boosh, it's not the guy off the Mighty Boosh, by the way. It's another name of their gods. And so their names are being changed. They're given a whole new identity. And the purpose is to wash out of them all the godliness, all their history that they've had. Because then they will become Babylonians. 3 years learning the literature, learning the history. They'd have loved the stories. I'm sure there were great novels and everything else they'd have been reading and learning the language, becoming Babylonians. And as we close, as we need to, I want to say that this is happening now. Okay, so firstly, the change in language, which undermines our very identity as men and women created in the image of God. The first word that I want to mention is tolerance, from the Latin tolerare. And it used to mean, I disagree with you, but I affirm your right to believe that. But now tolerance doesn't mean that. You're not allowed to say, I believe that that's wrong. You have to say, I affirm the idea. You see? Tolerance has changed its meaning. So that once, as Christians, we could be tolerant, and we were called tolerant, but now we're having the exact same attitude. That hasn't changed. The word tolerance has changed, so that we are now intolerant. Do you see? And then there's loads of others, but let's take the word marriage. Bible defines marriage for us. It's not that we're saying, a gay couple can't be together. If they're not believers, they can do whatever they like. They should have all sorts of rights. I agree with that. They shouldn't be penalised with taxes or whatever. But when we call that marriage between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, for 2,000 years, well, actually a lot longer than that, marriage has meant a man and a woman. Changed the meaning. Suddenly, over a period of 10 years, decide to redefine a word that has underpinned the family and humanity. And even man and male. God said, let us create man in our image, male and female. He created him. Now, what is man? Doesn't mean anything anymore. The meaning has changed. Male, it's like, well, I don't know if, a man, what we would have considered to be male 10 years ago, it's like, well, maybe that person, when a child is born, he may have a little, dinky hanging there, but we can't say he's a male. He'll have to decide that when he's older. That's where we're moving. Completely redefining the very core of our identity. So that as we take these things on, we become Babylonian. We take on all these new identities, that we acknowledge them as valid, that we affirm them. See, tolerance, remember, this is why the word tolerance is important, and why the changing of it is so important, because once we could have said, well, we affirm you in your decision to do that. God gave man the right, the ability, the freedom to sin. God, that's a God-given gift. We affirm your decision, whatever you want to do, that's up to you. But we're not saying it's right. That's what tolerance would have allowed us to say once, and we could have been considered tolerant. But now we have to affirm it or be intolerant. This is the situation that we're in today. You see how relevant the book of Daniel is. Daniel, all of these things are kind of happening. A change of words and meanings and everything else in an attempt to undermine their identity as children of God. Well, we'll think more about that next week. I just want to ask you to close your eyes and just reflect for a moment. There's a huge amount of pressure on us to conform to the new terms. Huge amount of pressure to affirm them. Just like Daniel, we didn't get to think about the food, we'll think about that next week, but just like Daniel was under huge pressure, we need wisdom from God. My biggest concern is that we're not thinking about this stuff much. We're just sort of being dragged along, and we're not thinking and we're not praying. I want to encourage you, Lord, give me wisdom. Make that your daily prayer so that I can answer wisely, not judgmentally. God is my judge, not me, but wisely. And secondly, I want to encourage us to be wise in the way that we raise children. The things that we're affirming, we need to be careful. We're not just taking on what's happening in the world. And thirdly, that we would articulate clearly, wisely, to a world in absolute confusion, what is true.